Welcome to a new episode of Café, entre Caminos podcast. I will be your host, Claudio Feijó, Monet Chair on Tech Diplomacy here at Technical University of Madrid. And today we are joined by Professor Michael Howland, the Stern Harold E. Egerton Assistant Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at MIT. And Michael, your research focuses on improving renewable energy systems like wind turbines to make them more efficient and reliable. And by combining advanced fluid mechanics simulations and real-world modeling, you are working to tackle big challenges in clean energy and climate systems. So first pressing question, no? After a little bit this impressive area where you work, can you tell us about your motivation? How did you end up in working in renewable energies and in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, happy to be here. So excited to talk with you further. Yeah, so pretty early on when I was actually in middle school, which in the United States is 6th, 7th, and 8th grade for context in the K through 12 primary education system, I decided pretty specifically that I wanted to work on climate change as the pressing challenge of my generation and of the 21st century. And it was even more specific than just working on climate change. I sort of had the clarity of thought, for whatever reason, that I believed it was more than that I just wanted to work on climate change, but my specific role was going to actually be in climate change mitigation. At that time, there was still lots of active debates in media and certainly in political discourse as to the extent to which climate change was an accepted scientific hypothesis or not. It was often framed as, do you believe in climate change? Which I always thought was a perverse framing because it's a hypothesis which is either confirmed or invalidated, not a belief structure. But that's a separate point. So that was the discourse at the time, and I wasn't as interested in that. So I knew that I didn't want to be a climate scientist as such. I believed the climate science. I accepted the theory of climate change, and I wanted to work on mitigating climate change based on that scientific consensus. So that's how I chose the career path, and that's how I ended up working in this area, and very specifically on renewable energy generation as the primary mechanism with which we can combat climate change.
I find it super interesting that education has an influence, no, in young people. So maybe this is a learning that important learning.
Yeah.
And then moving to more like you are working now. I understand your work mainly focuses on optimizing wind farms, no? These huge wind turbines. Mm-hmm. But can you explain a little bit more, like in simple terms, what is this optimization and why it's so important, and how do you actually work in it?
Yeah, of course. So perhaps at a higher level, the vision of our lab is really to accelerate decarbonization through a better understanding of what we call environment-energy system interactions. So the core philosophy is that as we simultaneously decarbonize, essentially reduce the carbon intensity of our energy system, but we also have climate already changing and weather patterns and extreme events changing at the same time, we are increasing the coupling of these two systems that have historically been separate. Historically, we've had an energy system which has largely relied on controllable, what the energy system would call dispatchable fossil fuels, where you pay for a fuel, you choose when to burn it, and it's exactly, in some sense, in your control, pending supply chain issues and so on. And separately, you have weather systems, which are chaotic systems, very challenging to forecast, as we all know, from the challenges of weather forecasting on both short-term and long-term timescales. And those have been separate. But as we decarbonize, as we generate more electricity with renewable production like wind, solar, hydrokinetic, et cetera, geothermal and others, and also as we electrify demand. And so, for example, I've seen lots of EVs around Madrid and new legislation being passed on sort of incentivizing electric vehicles. that's changing also the demand landscape of how we consume energy. And so all of these things together result in both supply of energy and demand of energy depending more strongly on variations in weather patterns, which are, again, challenging to forecast. So this is the coupling our lab is really interested in understanding at a high level. The primary tools we use are the fields of fluid mechanics, of mathematics like optimization, methods to quantify uncertainty, and make decisions in uncertain weather and climate conditions. So a lot of our work has focused on one really good example of this coupling between environmental and energy systems, which is in renewable power production through wind and solar. And so focusing on wind, it's a really nice example where, by definition, in some sense, the power generation of a wind farm depends on the weather patterns, the wind patterns that exist at that site, but really vary in both space and in time. And so questions like, where should we build wind farms? How should we design wind turbines? How should we control wind turbines? How should we control wind farms, which are collections of turbines? Those are the kinds of questions we're asking in that thrust of research.
That idea of where to build is super important, at least in Spain. And also, there's some commonality, no? The US and Spain, we are surrounded by seas, so in this we are similar. So I understand maybe offshore, maybe even floating, I'm not sure about that. Wind energy is said to become like a key element, no? So what do you think are the challenges? Are there any special challenges in offshore? Do you think this is the future in a way? Sorting, no, landscaping, problems that might appear, and making people more happy because they cannot see that, and also there's maybe more space, especially for countries like your country and my country. What can you tell us about offshore?
Yeah, so I'm glad you focused in on the question of siting and designing renewable plants, because this is a really critical issue and will become even more critical moving forward, because we really have two things that we're doing again at the same time. One is we're replacing in large part our traditional fossil fuel generation with renewable power, and for that it's a massive infrastructure change, both in building lots of renewable plants, lots of wind and solar farms, but also building a huge amount of transmission to connect these distributed energy resources into the power system. So deciding where we actually deploy these renewable plants is a really critical question that is exactly at the interface of weather and climate modeling, which tells us about the resource, but also the local constraints and also power system dynamics and electrical engineering and so on that we've historically considered in that development. So we think quite a lot about that, and I've been working actively in this area, both thinking about how do we design cost-effective power systems in today's climate, but also how we design resilient power systems that are decarbonized in future climates with minimized risk to things like extreme events. So focusing on the offshore question, in terms of the landscape of wind power, onshore wind power has been a really successful technology where the cost of electricity associated with wind power has declined precipitously over the past several decades, to the point that wind power is one of the cheapest forms of electricity generation that has ever existed in human society. So this is a really fantastic technology achievement, both of fundamental research, like our group is working on, but also of the energy and infrastructure industry to build such remarkable machines, which are some of the largest infrastructure elements we build in general, but also recognizing that they're large rotating machines. So they're definitely the largest rotating machines we build. So it's a really fantastic technology solution. And so onshore wind has really become quite inexpensive relative to other technologies recently. But the fundamental challenges remain in terms of having enough space, but also not just having enough space in general, space that simultaneously has good wind resource, but is also relatively straightforward to connect to the wider power system. And that's an especially important point in places like the United States, and indeed in Spain, where the resource potential for wind and solar may not be in the same location where lots of people live. And one solution is to build out a lot of transmission to connect locations where we can build renewable plants to where people live. That's very expensive and often challenging to do from an infrastructure standpoint. And so an alternative solution, rather than building wind and solar where it's cheap and transmitting it to where people live, is to build it close to where people live. And most humans live close to water systems, especially oceans. So that's really the value proposition of offshore wind. Now it comes at the penalty in some sense that it's a newer industry, and right now the costs are higher. So the major opportunities are in driving down the costs and making it more reliable.
So I'm a little bit intrigued what you were saying, no? About placing these complicated new infrastructures to where people live. But maybe we need to put it also close to, I don't know, new infrastructures like data centers. What do you think about that? No, because this is a challenge. No, sometimes now we can produce energy at a really low cost. No, in places like maybe U.S., Spain. Yeah. You mentioned wind, but also solar energy, and maybe this is the case for Spain. But is this also a main trend, or what can you tell us about this?
Yeah, I think it's an emerging area that offers a huge amount of potential to unlock new opportunities that we haven't even really considered yet. And so what we really have, because of this cost of energy really dropping for wind and solar, is an extremely low production of power, or extremely low cost production of power, but that's not always available. So in a way, it's completely different than fossil fuels, which have relatively high costs. You have to pay for the fuel every time you want to generate power, but you always choose to have it exactly when you want it. Instead, we have extremely low-cost renewables that are not always producing power. And so what are the new opportunities that this can enable to be more creative about how we actually consume power? One sort of jargony way that we talk about this is in power to X applications. So what we mean is we have power and we send it to X application, and X application can be sort of anything. And so how can we create new paradigms in how to consume power that is extremely low cost, but is not always available? And that could be in things like data centers, where we would have to think about constructing case-specific data centers that don't always need to be online, but then can be very productive and very low cost when the power is available. Perhaps that can be in artificial intelligence and machine learning opportunities, where the demand, let's say, in that case, can actually shift in time, is not always demanded. And in other kinds of opportunities, like sustainable manufacturing, production of low-carbon hydrogen, low-carbon cement, and so on.
And I'm also intrigued by something that you mentioned briefly. You mentioned about transmission. What makes transmission so complicated? Why you prefer to put the sources of renewable energy close to whatever, people, data centers, manufacturing centers? Yeah. What is the trick there?
Yeah, the primary challenge is one of cost, is that essentially transmission lines are relatively expensive per kilometer or per mile. And that's largely because we want to minimize how much power is lost in transmission, essentially resistive losses that come from transmitting power from one location to another. And the way to do that is to increase the voltage substantially. And then that comes at a higher cost of these transmission lines. So that's the kind of first order challenge. The second order challenge is that oftentimes these are sort of large and space-consuming infrastructure elements that
maybe even ugly, no?
Yeah, well, that's in the eye of the beholder and so on. Okay. Some people don't prefer the view of wind turbines. I think that they're beautiful infrastructure elements. So to each their own. Some people really like the look of transmission. It's sort of the pathway of the future. But yeah, in terms of the challenges is where do we actually build it? And we have to be thoughtful about how we build infrastructure to not disrupt communities that have already been harmed in the past in terms of how we've built infrastructure and energy historically. So this requires this kind of integrated planning and community engagement.
Following that line, I've noticed that your research involves not only engineering or I would say traditional engineering in the sense that you deal with infrastructure, but also environmental science. You mentioned weather. But actually, how does it work? How do you collaborate? How do you build partnership, or how do you integrate these two things in practice? How to make it? I always find a little bit challenging. No?
Yeah.
This multidisciplinarity is fantastic. Everybody will talk about that, but then when you actually do it, then complications appear.
Right. No, I think that's exactly true. I think the core thing is that it just takes a lot of time.
Right.
And people should really recognize that going in, it's going to be challenging to speak across these disciplinary lines, but that it's critically important to do so. And in some sense, when it comes to climate change, we really have no choice. Climate change will essentially touch every aspect of human society, and also solutions to climate change require essentially every skill set that human society has. That includes, of course, lots of engineering, but also lots of science, climate science, still tons of open questions there, but also things related to public policy, things related to legal challenges, and so on, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I could list these things for forever, and justice, and so on. So we really need a kind of all hands on deck approach in terms of mitigating climate change. When it comes to our group and how we think about it, we try to identify the opportunities where we can really help and play a role in terms of mitigating climate change in a meaningful way. So working not just on problems that are academically interesting, conceptually interesting to study because they're fun, but problems that also can have high potential for impact. And then if we have a core gap in our knowledge, then we try to find experts and collaborators who can complement us. And so it looks a little different in every project. We have a collaborative project right now with another professor in our department, Sarab Amin. He's an expert in systems and optimization, and so combining that with our expertise on fluid dynamics, renewable energy, and weather and climate, we're able to find transformational outcomes in terms of thinking about designing power systems of the future in changing climates. In other work, we collaborate with experts in fluid mechanics who work on experiments, so experimental fluids that helps to validate the computational and engineering models that we develop in our lab. And so it can look different in different applications, but I think the core thing is that it really takes time and engagement from both sides. It's not ever really in the first meeting that one immediately finds sort of novel outcomes. It takes a lot of time to understand each other.
Yeah, you need to fall in love a little bit, no?
Yeah.
And this takes time sometimes.
Right.
And maybe you can tell us something about, I don't know, the project that you are more interested now, or you think is has the biggest impact that you're working on currently, and tell us maybe a little bit of some details about that, no?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hard to pick one,
Okay.
as an academic.
You can pick several.
Yeah, as an academic, we're sort of excited about all of the projects in our lab. So perhaps I could speak more here in terms of the wind energy projects, which we've discussed a little bit already. And so one aspect that we study is how to design and control wind farms in an efficient way. So the core challenge is really that when we build large-scale renewable projects, we want to build enough generation that becomes useful to the power system. And an individual turbine may be on the order of a few megawatts, or even modern turbines are on the order of, let's say, 10 megawatts of power production, which is a good amount, but in terms of the power system is a relatively small footprint. So what we really want are collections of turbines that generate more like hundreds of megawatts or even gigawatts of power. And so that's why we put wind turbines in close proximity in wind farm configurations. It also achieves economies of scale, lowers the total cost. They can share that land area or offshore lease area. And they also can share that connection to the wider transmission system. And so we build these wind farms, and it makes a lot of sense to do so for various economic and power systems reasons. But from a fluid mechanics standpoint, it's not very ideal, because each individual turbine will extract some amount of kinetic energy from the incident wind. That will create what we call a wake region downwind, which is characterized by having relatively less kinetic energy. And you could think about it just from a conservation of energy standpoint. If you have some amount of energy coming into the farm, a turbine will extract some, there's going to be less available immediately downwind. And so that ends up being detrimental for wind farms where individual turbines are placed nearby one another, and they're sort of stealing energy from each other at a wind farm level. And so our lab is thinking about ways to design wind farms, but also to control wind farms actively in time to mitigate interactions between these turbines. And historically, in this community and in the industry, it's been typical to try and control turbines individually to try and maximize the power of each individual turbine. But instead, our group, among others in this research field, are thinking about how do we control wind farms collectively as one. One technology is that we can change essentially how much force the turbines put on the incident wind, and we can change that through control systems. We can do this autonomously in some sense, so by simply from software solutions. And the other thing that we can do is we can actually change the relative orientation of the turbine with respect to the incident wind direction. And so we can misalign turbines with the incident wind and laterally deflect or steer this kinetic energy deficit wake region in the direction we choose away from downwind turbines.
It's so fascinating. I feel like researching that field, no? After your talk. I have two final questions, a little bit challenging, I think. But the first one, how do you see yourself in, I don't know, 10 years time from now, maybe 15, 20, you choose. And also, how do you see the world you're working in that time? So it's you and also what is surrounding you, no, in this domain, or which are your expectations? I don't know.
Yeah, well, ideally in 20 years, we'll have made a major dent in our decarbonization goals, and that will hopefully free me up to work on some other things. But you know, this is, of course, in some sense aspirational. This is what we're striving towards. Yeah, I hope that our group can continue to work on research that can have a translatable and large-scale impact on climate change mitigation. Sure. And so that's really our target. And so certainly staying within academia, but a great thing about academic research is that you can have a footprint beyond fundamental research, which is, of course, our day-to-day, but you can also have engaging conversations and inform policy. You can also work closely and engage with industry and make translatable impact, you know, from fundamental discoveries to industry applications.
So I take from your comment, I take that this is a slow-moving industry, and there will be chances in 20 years' time still to optimize and improve things, no? So.
Well, we'll see. I mean, it depends on both technology developments and adoption, but it also depends on larger scale questions, infrastructure decisions and policy decisions in terms of the deployment and mobilization of large capital to mitigate climate change. So it's, as I mentioned before, climate change is really an all hands on deck. Everything is coupled together. Yeah. So innovations, you know, in the lab in wind and solar and uncertainty in climate and so on, they have to be mobilized at scale to make a meaningful difference. And so that's what makes this a uniquely difficult challenge, but also a uniquely interesting challenge to work on. It's a little bit different than sort of building just one, you know, new tech device and selling it to people. Yeah, this is a large-scale change to infrastructure systems and how we live as humans.
True. And final question. Any message you want to deliver to young engineers, to engineers to be, people who might be listening to this podcast and might be interested in moving into this domain or any other thing that you consider?
Yeah, no, I mean, more than anything, I would just say to get involved. I remember very vividly in my first semester as an undergraduate, I was in mechanical engineering, and the instructor was surveying the class, seeing what everyone was passionate about, and so he was listing different applications like who loves cars, and most of the students raised their hands, and who wants to be a rocket scientist and work on sort of space exploration. A bunch of people raised their hands, and he noticed that I never raised my hand with anything that he said, and I said, well, that's because you didn't say any mitigating climate change, you didn't say renewable energy. And I was really surprised about it because it seems to me the engineering of the future. We have to build sustainable engineering and infrastructure systems, and we have to mitigate climate change. It's a really, really fun engineering challenge, but also touches on all of the modern themes. You can be a transformational researcher in artificial intelligence and machine learning and work on computer science, but make a huge impact on climate change. It's about the application that you choose to work on. And we need everybody with all of these methods to work on this problem together.
Okay, so thanks so much, Michael. I think it has been a fantastic interview. So thanks so much for being here in Madrid with us.
Thanks for having me.